Welcome back to the Fifth Down Fantasy Podcast. Today we are talking week 2 starts, stits, and stats to know. Everything in between. We have some buys, we have some sells, we have some matchups we really like. We have players to watch for next week. Without further ado, let's get right into it with the players that we love this week and some guys that we are buying low on. Ben, let's start with you. Who is the first player you are buying for this week?
If there is somebody I can be starting across every single fantasy team I have, it's Trevor Lawrence. He's projected by my projection model as the QB4 this week. Now that he has what is one of the best legitimate passing offenses in the NFL and what's projected to be an absolute up-tempo shootout against Kansas City. Trevor Lawrence didn't even need Christian Kirk, who by the way was a wide receiver 1 last year, the wide receiver 11 overall, and he's still talented. He's still good despite shifting back into that slot role he played in Arizona. But if the coverage is ever too good on Ridley, get the ball to Christian Kirk. Even if Zay Jones, he had a solid week 1, but even get him involved. He had a 22% team target share for 55 yards and a touchdown. And last week, Jared Goff didn't look good in his week 1 debut, but frankly, neither did the Kansas City defense. Yes, the Lions on paper should be an elite top scoring team, but Jared Goff ranked 33rd last week. Yes, 33rd in on-target percentage throws according to SIS. Trevor Lawrence won't have that problem. He did not have that problem last week. In a shootout, he is my QB4. Love him this week.
Yeah, the Chiefs and Jaguars game is expected to be one of the highest totals on the week. There's going to be a lot of points scored this week. And the really nice thing for Trevor Lawrence in fantasy is that Jacksonville has a horrible defense. Speaking of horrible defenses, how about the Chargers, who have a horrendous defense, and now they're playing the Titans, who just allowed Derek freaking Carr to throw for 330 yards against them in week 1. I think Justin Herbert does that and a little bit of more. The Titans were also the second worst team versus wide receivers, which is the strength of this Chargers passing attack. And I expect that Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, and pretty much everybody in this offense, whether Austin Eckler is playing or not, to produce. This Titans defense is horrible on the outside. Justin Herbert is going to take big advantage. I'm projecting 30 fantasy points this week is my bold prediction.
We've heard a little bit about Austin Eckler maybe potentially dealing with a high ankle injury. The Chargers also have a pretty bad defense, by the way, and I want to talk about that in just a second. But Austin Eckler, if he sits, anything change if Josh Kelly is the RB1 for this team?
Yeah, I think obviously if Josh Kelly is the RB1 for this team, they're probably going to pass a little bit more and probably be a little bit less off the run. Tennessee, the past couple of years and in week 1 has been a little more stout against the run than as that's probably the strength of their defense. So in general, I would expect them to pass a little bit more, and I think that could increase a lot, especially without Austin Eckler. I don't think they want to use both Josh Kelly or even Isaiah Spiller if Austin Eckler doesn't play as a pass catcher.
Absolutely. And Josh Kelly, he had a pretty decent job filling in for Austin Eckler. He had a very decent fantasy game. I'd be starting him if Austin Eckler doesn't sit. Obviously, I'm happy starting anybody from this offense. But on the other side of the ball, the Chargers have one of the worst defenses last week, too. They got sliced and diced by Miami. And we saw DeAndre Hopkins had an astonishing 39.4% target share. That ranked 3rd behind rookies Zay Flowers and Puka Nacua. And that Chargers defense, who was awful, we should be seeing DeAndre Hopkins face up against Michael Davis. He saw 10 targets come his way. He allowed 9 catches on those 10 targets for 90 yards and a passer rating against of 137.5. That is crazy. If DeAndre Hopkins' target share remains high, he should absolutely have high-end wide receiver 1 numbers. But unfortunately, last week, what we saw, even though he had this really great target percentage, Ryan Tannehill, his completion percentage was just 47.1%. I think that's the only knock you have right now on DeAndre Hopkins. But we can expect his completion percentage to regress to his career average of about 64%. It's actually higher, 66% over his last 4 years. And I know your thing, Alex, is you don't want any piece of this passing offense. But the Chargers defense was atrocious, absolutely atrocious last week. DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Have no problem throwing him in as a wide receiver 2 this week.
Yeah, again, we've noted a lot on this podcast that I'm not a fan of DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy football this year. I think this is a rare, really good matchup. Like I said, I think the Chargers are going to take advantage early, force this to be a pseudo shootout where the Titans are going to have to throw the ball and they won't be able to just rely on their run game and Derrick Henry and chewing the clock out. So I think this is one of those rare matchups for me that I am going to be in on DeAndre Hopkins, the same way that I'm going to be in on a lot of same team running backs this year. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson. I think all four of those guys finished as top 24 running backs this year. Right now, the Lions are going up against a really poor run defense in the Seattle Seahawks that have given up a lot of work to pass catchers in the past. I think that they gave the running backs in week 1 over 30 touches. I think they're going to split it a little bit more evenly this week, which will be productive for David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Falcons, same thing. Green Bay was the worst run defense in football in week 1, allowed the highest rate of carries over 10 yards, bottom 5 in giving up yards after contact. I think both Bijan and Tyler Algier star this week.
I have a friend who told me that he has Bijan Robinson. He drafted Tyler Algier as a handcuff, and he says to me, do you feel comfortable starting both of those guys? One in the flex spot. He also has Nick Chubb. Where are you at there? Do you think that both of those guys are starting if you have them on the same team? Or is it more if you have one, play them, but probably you're limiting your upside if you play both?
I think it just depends on the personnel you have. I mean, there's been a lot of injuries that have happened. So if you have Austin Eckler and Austin Eckler ends up sitting, you don't have a Joshua Kelly, I'd be playing Tyler Algier. So I think that he's not like a must start, has to be in your lineup. But if you need a flex play, you're missing someone like Deontay Johnson or maybe Austin Eckler if he misses this game, or someone else, or Christian Watson, and you need a flex play, Tyler Algier is okay as a flex play and not just a handcuff for this week.
Completely agree with you. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, too. I've been touting them as one of my absolute favorite duos. The entire Detroit Lions offense has been full of stars, and that duo at running back, I'm really high on them, too. There's a duo of wide receivers that I'm really high on this week, and I know I'm going to get a lot of funny looks from you on this one, Alex. I really like Chris Godwin and Mike Evans both this week. Surprisingly, Baker Mayfield was able to sustain a fantasy-relevant day for Mike Evans. He was the wide receiver 12, and Chris Godwin didn't have an amazing week 1, but 5 receptions, 51 yards. He had another target in the red zone that would have placed him top 24 if it converted for a touchdown. That seems decent enough. Good opportunities for both of those guys, and they're both projected in my projection model this week as top 24 wide receivers because they're going up against this Chicago defense that allowed the 3rd highest net yards per attempt last week against the Packers, who, not great. But normally the argument here is, Jordan Love is a better quarterback than Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield has not been a good quarterback. But is Jordan Love better than Baker Mayfield? Baker Mayfield, I'm not going to sell you on Baker Mayfield. I cannot tell you anything for you to think, wow, Baker Mayfield is an elite quarterback. But he was good with the Browns. He was fine with the Browns until injuries took their toll. And he never quite looked right last year, bouncing around from an awful Carolina offense to a decimated Los Angeles Rams team. But he had a solid 94.1 passer rating last week, and the Bears defense ran a top 5 rate of cover 2, according to SIS. And in his career, Baker Mayfield has an 84% passer rating versus cover 2 with 8 yards per attempt, a 69% completion percentage. I think both of these guys will see plenty of looks. And hopefully both finish within the top 36.
Yeah, Baker Mayfield last week, obviously sustained Mike Evans, the top wide receiver. Chris Godwin could have gotten there, didn't get there. I think that's what a lot we're going to see from Baker Mayfield this season, where it's only going to be maybe one guy a week that ends up producing. So it definitely makes me hesitate wanting to play both of those guys. I think one of them produces, but I think you're going to be playing, pin the tail on the donkey, or you're flipping a coin every single week, and whether it's going to be the Mike Evans week or the Chris Godwin week. Do you think, though, that there are going to be weeks going forward where both of them are going to be fantasy viable, or is this they've just had 2 really good matchups back to back that can allow them to do this?
Yeah, I think it's a great matchup. I don't think most weeks I'll be saying, hey, Chris Evans and Mike Evans are both must starts. I don't even know that I'd call them must starts, to be honest with you. I just think that in a decent matchup, I know that we're like, Baker Mayfield, like Mike Evans had a good week and Chris Godwin didn't. I'm still starting Chris Godwin this week. Man, we're having trouble with these wide receiver names right now, Alex. Chris Godwin is somebody I'd feel comfortable starting despite the poor showing in week 1. And Mike Evans, good showing week 1, good matchup week 2. Start him as well.
Someone that is, I think, going to play a similar role to Chris Godwin this year as maybe an over-the-middle safety blanket, kind of do it all, line them up anywhere player is Elijah Moore, who also had a week 1, but he had 7 targets in week 1 and what was an absolute blowout. And I think that Elijah Moore is going to continue his success into week 2. I mean, again, like I mentioned, he had 7 targets versus some really tough Bengals corners. and the Steelers got absolutely worked in against man coverage superstar Brandon Aiyuk. And I think that Elijah Moore is actually a really great separator versus man coverage. And this is going to be a perfect matchup for him. I think we see a lot of success from Elijah Moore. And not only is he a good play this week, he is a buy low if you can find him. I've seen him on some of my waiver wires. And to me, I think that he is like the perfect target after seeing over a 25% target share last week.
Elijah Moore really impressed me in his first game with the Browns. I think I was not in on him until you started kind of hyping him up, saying that his PFF grades were solid. And I think a big thing was Deshaun Watson kind of looked like a shell of himself, like he did at the end of last week. Deshaun Watson, I'm still not sold on Deshaun Watson, but if he's able to get the ball to Elijah Moore, so be it. I have no problem firing him up as well. But I do think that it's time we talk about the other side of the ball in that game, and that is the Pittsburgh Steelers. We're going to start talking about some of the bad matchups, some of the sits, some of the fades we got going on this week. And I just have here in big letters on the show sheet, whole Steelers offense. There are some concerns with Najee Harris's workload. He only played 8 more snaps than teammate Jaylen Warren, who, Alex, you're going to talk about him later on in the show. But Najee Harris saw twice as many rushes. He was in a negative game script for the entire game. I still think I'm bullish on Najee. I'd prefer him to Jaylen Warren. But now the Steelers are taking on the Browns defense. Last week, the Browns ran 11 dropbacks in man coverage with only 2 completions allowed. And now you put that on top of Deontay Johnson, who's going to be missing at least 4 weeks. Kenny Pickett, who ranked 32nd, only ahead of Zach Wilson in 2022 in passer rating against man defense. Pat Freiermuth, he has a chest injury. He may not be able to suit up for this game. And this defense shut down Joe Burrow last week. D. Higgins, 9 targets, 10 targets, 8 targets, 0 catches. Not only was Najee Harris uninspiring, this entire Pittsburgh offense was uninspiring, and they're going up against what is probably right now, after week 1, a top 5 secondary in the entire NFL. I'm not starting a Steeler unless it's Najee Harris and I have an elite RB1 to pair ahead of him. I mean, yikes. Nobody on this offense is inspiring me this week.
Yeah, I think I agree more on the offense in general than I do about the Cleveland defense actually being really good. Again, they shut down probably one of the best offenses in the league week 1, but I think that was most likely more of a fluke and a change of defensive personnel, and I don't think the Bengals were expecting what the Browns were to throw at them, but overall, I'm not sure how much I love their pieces on defense. But that being said, I think the Steelers offense is like primed to be really, really terrible as long as Deontay Johnson is out, because he's their guy that's their chain mover on 3rd down. And I think this offense, similar to last week, is going to be woefully inefficient without Deontay Johnson and not someone that Kenny Pickett can have each and every time to throw to. Do you expect better days to come for the Steelers offense down the road? Like, would you be buying any Steelers players, even if not this week?
I'm buying Deontay Johnson if you can sustain him on your IR spot. Otherwise, I'm a diehard Steelers fan, Alex. This is a grim outlook. That was a bad showing week 1. It's going to be another bad showing week 2.
Well, I think someone else that's definitely going to have a bad showing is going to be Alexander Mattison. He is my sell high of the week at the running back position. I mean, he got about 15 touches last week and was super inefficient against the Bucs defense that's pretty good. Now he's playing a really good Eagles defensive line on Thursday night. And I just don't see a world where Alexander Mattison stays as like their bell cow running back for the entire season. I think this offense, at least from running the ball, is going to be taking a big step back. And I don't think people realize just how much Dalvin Cook elevates this offense. And in a week-to-week high volume role, I don't think Alexander Madison's going to be able to sustain it. And I think that what we saw last week is going to continue into this week. And guys like Ty Chandler are going to continue to eat into his workload.
And that regression is incoming too. Last year, the Vikings they went 11-0 against one possession games. They lost a 1-possession game last week, 0-1. Suddenly that streak is over. And I know, it's a joke like, oh, that regression is incoming, but like, no, this wasn't a good team last year. They got very lucky. And now this year, they're going to find themselves again in close games. They're going to be passing the ball a lot. Kirk Cousins had 44 attempts last week. Holy moly. And this just isn't a guy who's projected, I think, to see a ton of work when you consider he's not efficient. They're going to be passing the ball a lot. And Ty Chandler is going to start working into there. As far as sell highs go, I have a sell high at the wide receiver position. It's going to be Zay Flowers. And a lot of you are probably like, no, Zay Flowers is him. Yeah, Zay Flowers looked absolutely incredible last week. But let me ask you something. Zay Flowers, wide receiver, 20.5 point PPR. He had a 47.6% target percentage. That was the second highest target share a rookie has had in their debut since at least the year 2000s. But what happens now that Mark Andrews returns, right? Last year with Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson on the field, Andrews had a 32.3 target percent. How is Zay Flowers going to sustain a 50% target share? He's just not, right? They have a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. Mark Andrews had 7 targets per game last year. Keep in mind, this was also a rush-heavy offense last year. I just don't see a world where Mark Andrews takes a backseat to a rookie wide receiver. Not to mention, Lamar Jackson, he only rushed 6 times against the Texans last week. That's the lowest number he's had since week 1 of last year. This volume for Zay Flowers, yeah, he's really good. But man, sell him high because with Andrews active, I mean, yeah, he's probably a flex option, but he's not that wide receiver 2 or even wide receiver 1 you're hoping him to be.
Well, you should definitely be selling him high because I actually just made a trade this morning where I traded Zay Flowers for Garrett Wilson, who is the next player I'm going to talk about. I don't like Garrett Wilson this week, though. I mean, he's been an outside the top 40 wide receiver with Zach Wilson. He was outside the top 40 wide receivers in air yards last week. The Cowboys absolutely decimated the entire Giants offense, and I don't think that their corners are that amazing, but they did add Stephon Gilmore, and I just think that any wide receiver with Zach Wilson is going to be woefully inefficient. But I did note that I just traded Zay Flowers for Garrett Wilson. I expect this Jets team to be adding some form of quarterback play very soon. They are not going to let their entire season rest on the hands of Zach Wilson. They won 1 game with him off a punt return touchdown, and they had to get really lucky. But I think long-term, they're going to add another quarterback. Garrett Wilson is a buy low for me for when they add that future quarterback. This week, I hate his matchup against the Cowboys, but if you can trade Zay Flowers for him, I'd do it.
I would do that too. That is nuts. I do know we heard Robert Saleh say that he wanted to let Zach Wilson be the starting quarterback of this team. And I don't know if that's just coach speak because you want Zach Wilson to be like, yeah, this is my team. And I'm going to be a good quarterback. This was Zach Wilson's team last year. He was not good. I mean, I think everybody was high on Garrett Wilson taking the second-year leap this year because of the talent, but more so because of the quarterback change. I don't know that I'd be comfortably projecting him top 24 week in and week out with Zach Wilson at quarterback. Do you think that it is coach speak? And by what week do you think we might see a new quarterback, if at all, in this offense?
I bet we'll see a new quarterback within 3 weeks. Maybe Zach Wilson will start this week. Maybe he'll start one more, but I don't see him starting beyond 3 starts. I mean, he was just horrendous against the Bills. I know the Bills are a good defense, but like there was no throwing the ball downfield. There was no hope for anyone. I mean, they had one crazy Garrett Wilson touchdown, but like that's the only hope for this offense every week is that Garrett Wilson can make a catch of the year week in and week out. It's not going to happen. They're going to have to find veteran help. They know this team is projected to win now, and they're going to have to find another quarterback to do it.
I got to ask too, I think, is there a certain quarterback? Like, is there a certain quarterback that you think would really be good on this team? Low key, maybe again, Steelers fan. I think Mitch Trubisky would be really frisky.
Oh,
and he's not a name I'm seeing thrown around. No, why not? I think he's better than Zach Wilson. But is there a name that? Is there a name, and he'd be cheap as heck. Is there a name that you think you would want to see this team go after?
My dream quarterback for Zach Wilson, I mean, I say dream with quotation marks because like there's no great options. Tom Brady's not coming out of retirement. It would probably be Matt Ryan for me because to me, Matt Ryan is just older Jared Goff where people are going to slash him and say that he's not great, but he can get his wide receivers the ball. Same thing. Jared Goff, not great, but can he get Amon-Ra St. Brown the ball? Absolutely. Matt Ryan does that for his number 1 wide receiver every year of his career. His wide receivers average over 150 targets a year. If they can coax him to come out and play for the Jets this year, that would be my dream scenario.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. Matt Ryan, obviously incredibly disappointing in Indianapolis. But we'll move on from Garrett Wilson on to another second-year wide receiver in Drake London, who, if you're waiting for the Drake London breakout, you're waiting another week. It is not happening this week. Last week, the Packers defense ran 45 of 48 plays in zone defense. That is by far the highest rate in the NFL. They rank 7th in zone, if you include 2020 data. And Drake London, he had 84% of his snaps out wide in 2022. 97.7% last week. He's a wide receiver. He plays out wide, no doubt about it. Now, Desmond Ridder, 19 completions on 35 attempts to players lined up out wide against zone for an astonishing 72% pass rating. That ranks 39th among the 45 quarterbacks who have had at least 30 attempts versus zone since the start of 2020. I know I'm just spewing data. I know that this is a small sample. 16 of those 35 attempts were to Drake London. He wasn't very impressive in any of them. And last week, Drake London had absolutely nothing. 0 catches, 0 yards, 1 target. Arthur Smith didn't care. He said Drake London didn't care. Coach speak or not, London, he's going to get his targets. Maybe he gets a handful of targets. But Desmond Ridder has not been good against zone, especially when targeting his wide receivers. So Drake London not going to have his breakout this week. I don't think you can risk starting him for another sub 5-point start. So maybe he gets a touchdown if he's lucky, but he's not having a breakout. He's not having a 10-point week.
We talked about this all offseason. Like, low volume passing offenses are just horrible for wide receivers. I mean, they passed 18 times last week. Obviously, that's bound to go up this week. But again, like, it's just not going to be consistent week to week. And all the things that you highlighted have been their matchup. Not a good week for Drake London. I also don't think that Brandon Aiyuk is going to have the same wide receiver 1 level week that he had last week. They're playing the Rams, who run one of the highest rates of zone in the NFL. And Deebo Samuel is the zone beater. Brandon Aiyuk is the guy to target and man coverage, which is what we saw against the Steelers. But Deebo and George Kittle are more their guys versus zone than Brandon Aiyuk are. For me, if I could trade Brandon Aiyuk for someone like a Chris Olave or an Amon-Ra St. Brown, like, I've seen a couple of those just insane trades that people are sitting there shaking their head like it doesn't happen. But if you could trade Brandon Aiyuk for like a top 12 wide receiver right now, I would do it. The San Francisco 49ers still bottom 5 in pass attempts 3 out of the last 4 years. They had only 29 pass attempts in week 1. This team's just never going to throw the ball. You can trade for Brandon Aiyuk for a top 12 wide receiver only, I would do it.
Yeah, I mean, what happens next week when instead of Aiyuk having 2 touchdowns, it's Christian McCaffrey or George Kittle? Or what happens when it's Deebo Samuel's week? Yeah, this was an impressive showing from Aiyuk. I still think he's probably going to be somebody that I would start week in and week out if he was on my roster. But what you saw last week, that is not what you were going to see from Aiyuk. And I mean, this offense, so many mouths to feed. Brock Purdy is good. I think we talked about this on the show earlier in the offseason. Brock Purdy was the only quarterback with at least 100 pass attempts last year to have a higher EPA per play than Patrick Mahomes. EPA is highly regarded as one of the best predictive analytics when it comes to quarterback play. I mean, Brock Purdy, there's no denying this dude. This dude is a talent. And like Alex said, if you can trade him for a top 12 player, I would be. And if you're looking for players that you want to be keeping your eye on, maybe guys that you can include in these package trades, maybe they're sitting on somebody's deep rosters and you're like, oh, I want to trade away and trade for. These are the guys you should be getting. I think you should be keeping your eye on and trading for Tank Bigsby. He had a touchdown last week, which is awesome. But more than anything, I think we also saw Tank Bigsby with 2 green zone carries to Travis Etienne's 1. And Travis Etienne impressed me. He looked better than I would have expected him to be in week 1. But we still saw Tank Bigsby eat into that workload, and we still saw him have a touchdown. We think he's going to continue to have touchdowns and at least split goal line, red zone, green zone carries with Travis Etienne. And listen, he's cheap. But if something happens to Travis Etienne, we were just talking at the top of the show about how this is one of the best passing offenses in the NFL. I want a piece of that offense if I can. And there's a chance that Tank Bigsby starts at least 1 game by the end of the season. So Tank Bigsby, that's a guy I want to be keeping my eye on in week 2 and forward.
I like Bigsby. The guy I'd be going for instead would be Jaylen Warren of the Steelers. I don't know how this is possible because he's continued to outplay Najee every week. Ian Rappaport himself said that they think that Jaylen Warren could take over this backfield over the course of the season. And what did Jaylen Warren do in week 1? Even though the offense was terrible, he outproduced Najee Harris. He's now owned in only 42% of Yahoo leagues. If he's out there and you have an open bench spot, Jaylen Warren's the guy for me.
No, he's not. He had the same number of fantasy points and half-point PPR as Najee Harris, and he had, maybe more receptions, but he had fewer rushes. This backfield's going to be a mess. I don't want Jaylen Warren. Najee Harris is the guy, and Jaylen Warren is not the guy. A guy who might be the guy is Roschon Johnson. I really do think that as that game kind of got out of hand, we saw Roschon Johnson come in more so on those passing plays. But we've been saying that throughout the entire offseason. The reason Roschon Johnson is the guy I'm most interested in this backfield is because he is a big body running back who is going to not only earn goal line carries, he is going to earn the pass blocking role. And Justin Fields, 37 pass attempts. That is a career high for him last week. Once Roschon Johnson is on the field catching checkdowns, on the goal line carries, once this offense starts to gel, Roschon Johnson, I think, is going to be the guy who is touching the ball the most by the end of the season. Backfield's a mess to project anyway, but Roschon Johnson probably free, probably on your waivers. Ease it in. Go ahead, take a look. Keep your eye on him.
He's one of my favorite targets this week. He's only owned in 27% of leagues right now, which makes no sense to me. I saw this morning. I could not believe this. But Roschon Johnson was a top 10 running back in week 1. I know it came mostly in garbage time when the Packers starters were off the field, but he still finished as a top 10 running back in fantasy. He looked like the best running back. He did lead this backfield in snaps, garbage time or not, and he commanded the most targets. All things that are great for that profile to be looking for is someone that could take over the backfield. Don't forget the athletic. Also highlighted he could take over the backfield maybe by week 4 or week 5. I would side with them. Someone else to be looking at if you're in deeper leagues, Zack Moss. I mean, Evan Hull is done for the year. We only have Jake Funk to worry about. And Deion Jackson was the worst, 15-plus touch running back in the entire NFL week 1. Before Zack Moss was hurt, they said that he was probably going to be the running back 1 with Jonathan Taylor out. He has a dream matchup against the Houston Texans, maybe 2 more weeks after this where Jonathan Taylor is still not going to be playing. I think he could be the running back 1. This offense looked a lot better than we expected it to. And if you're in a deeper league, I think Zack Moss is definitely my player to watch.
Zack Moss is interesting to me, and I was also really, really impressed by Anthony Richardson. I mean, that dude, he had 22 fantasy points last week, and he did not look good in real football, right? But he was still leading good. He had a ton of points. My concern is that he's just going to be the RB1 on this team, like the RB1 in quotes, because he's just going to take off. He's going to score the touchdowns. It's going to limit anybody else's upside. But Zack Moss, they traded for him last year. I think they're interested in seeing what he's got. If he's got anything in the tank, he might. And if he doesn't, he's really on your waivers. It costs nothing to get him. And we like having running backs who we know are going to have that bell cow role, even if it's in a bad offense. So, yeah, it's worth taking a shot on Zack Moss.
Yeah, again, deeper leagues, don't probably need him in a 10-team league, but if you're in a 12-team league or deeper, Zack Moss is definitely someone that can fit a bench spot in your league if your bench is not deep enough yet. But again, that is everything you need to know for week 2, the starts, sits, and stats to know. But again, we'll be back every single Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time to give you more fantasy football goodness. Don't forget to check out the 33rd Team Podcast Network. New podcast dropping pretty much every single day with all the fantasy goodness that you could possibly hope for. But until next time, don't forget to keep chasing that upside. Let's go win some weeks.